The year is 1944. The Allied advance in Italy had ground to a bloody halt. Winston Churchill famously called Italy the soft underbelly of Europe, but as the Allied armies pushed north from their landings in Sicily and Salerno, they discovered that this underbelly was protected by a mighty defense line. The Italian peninsula was a natural fortress of mountains and fast-flowing rivers. The Germans, under the brilliant defense command of Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, had turned this landscape into a series of deadly traps known collectively as the Winter Line. The strongest of these was the Gustav Line, a chain of fortifications that stretched from coast to coast. Its purpose was singular: to stop the Allies from reaching Rome. And the lynch of the entire Gustav Line lied in the valley of Liris. In the linchpin of the entire Gustav Line, the cork in the bottle of the Liris Valley, the main highway to Rome, was a singular dominant mountain, and its base sat at the town of Cassino. And on its summit, gleaming 1,700 feet above the valley, stood a 1,400-year-old abbey, Monte Cassino. For 4 terrible months, this single point on the map would have become one of the most savage battlefields of the Second World War. It became the meat grinder for the armies of a dozen nations. This is the story of the 4 battles of Monte Cassino. The fortress wasn't just a mountain, it was the geography of hell. To advance, the allies of the U.S. Fifth Army, commanded by General Mark Clark, had to cross the Rapido River, which was swollen by winter rains that turned into icy, fast-flowing torrents. The valley floor was a flooded, muddy plain pre-sighted by German artillery. And in the defenses sat the elite. The German 10th Army was anchored by the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division paratroopers. They were veterans, fanatically loyal, and masters of defensive warfare. They had turned the mountainside into a web of interlocking machine gun nests, mortar pits, minefields, and bunkers. And watching over all of it, or so it seemed, was the ancient monastery. The monastery had become a symbol, a prize for the U.S. armies to capture. The first battle began on January 17, 1944. The plan was a frontal assault. The U.S. 36th Texas Division was ordered to do the impossible: cross the Rapido River directly in front of the town. The Germans knew this was the only logical crossing point. They were waiting for them. The men of the 36th were ordered forward into the perfect killing zone for the Germans. As they launched their assault boats, they were torn to shreds by pre-sighted mortars and MG-42 machine guns. The boats were disintegrated. Men were scythed down in the icy water. The few who made it to the far bank were trapped in the minefields, tangled in barbed wire, and annihilated by German counterattacks. The division's own commander, General Fred Walker, had called the plan a bloody, hopeless task, and in 48 hours, the 36th Division suffered over 2,000 casualties. It was a catastrophic, unmitigated disaster that would later trigger a congressional investigation. The first attempt to break the Gustavo Line had drowned in blood. This failure created a crisis in command. The Allied soldiers, freezing in their wet foxholes in the valley, stared up at the mountain. The monastery, looking down at them almost laughing, became a symbol of their misery, a hypnotic, evil presence to them, and they knew they had to capture it. A New Zealand soldier, Brick Lormer, later said, "It became a hypnotic attraction. It embodied everything in evil, waiting, watching, glorying down from that sheer hill." The new commander of the sector, General Bernard Freyberg of the New Zealand Corps, was a blunt, tough soldier. His corps, which included the 4th Indian Division, was tasked with the next assault. He looked at the monastery and made a decision. He would not send his men to die below it while he stood. He became convinced that the Germans were using it as an artillery observation post, a military necessity that had to be destroyed. The German commander on the mountain, General von Schneger, was a devout Catholic. He had, in fact, given his word that no German soldiers would enter the monastery, respecting its historical and religious sanctity. He even helped the monks evacuate many of its priceless art treasures to the Vatican. But sadly, in war, perception is reality. And despite protests from General Clark, Freyberg's demand went up the chain of command, and the order was given. On the morning of February 15th, leaflets were dropped, warning of the impending attack. Then, the skies filled with Allied bombers. B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-25 Michaels, and B-26 Marauders. In waves, they dropped over 1,000 tons of high explosives and incendiaries onto the abbey. The 1,400-year-old home of St. Benedict was pulverized, reducing it to a smoking crater. The primary victims were not German soldiers, but the hundreds of Italian civilians and monks who had huddled inside its ancient walls seeking refuge from the battle. However, that very night, the German Fallschirmjäger, the paratroopers who had been forbidden from the abbey, moved into the ruins. The intact building had been a poor defensive position. The rubble, a maze of shattered stone, deep craters, twisted rebar, and fortified cellars, was a fortress, and it was a defender's dream. The Allies had not destroyed an observation post. They had created an indestructible pillbox for the most elite army. Once a civilian sanctuary had now become a complex defensive position, and now the rubble had to be taken. The third battle began on March 15th. It was called Operation Dickens. The plan, another massive bombing, this time to obliterate the town of Cassino at the base of the mountain. Over 1,200 tons of bombs and 190,000 artillery shells turned the town into a moonscape, a landscape of pulverized stone. As the dust settled, the New Zealanders and the 4th Indian Division attacked. But deep in the cellars and sewers, the German paratroopers had survived. What followed was some of the most brutal street fighting of the entire war. Soldiers called Cassino the Leningrad of the South. It was not a battle of tactics. It was a room-by-room, hand-by-hand butchery. Snipers occupied every pile of rubble, and machine guns firing from collapsed buildings all over the town of Cassino. The 28th Battalion fought for days to capture the fortified railway station, taking it at an enormous cost, only to be cut off and forced to withdraw. Above the town, on Castle Hill, British troops from the 4th Indian Division fought for a foothold. In this legendary skirmish, a battalion seized a tiny exposed ridge just below the monastery ruins, known as Hangman's Hill. For nearly 2 weeks, these men held on, surrounded and cut off, supplied only by airdrops. They fought off constant German counterattacks in a display of breathtaking courage. However, they were unaware that they could not be reinforced. By the end of March, drenched in rain and mired in rubble, the third battle had failed. The Allies were exhausted, demoralized, and had been defeated again by the mighty German army. It was now May 1944. The Allies had to break the line. A new grand offensive was planned, Operation Dedham. The commander of the Allied armies in Italy, General Harold Alexander, had a new, brilliant plan inspired by the French general Alphonse Juin. The plan was simple. It was to be a symphony of deception and overwhelming force. The British 8th Army was secretly moved from the Adriatic coast, concentrating 20 divisions and 1,600 artillery pieces for the assault. This time, they would not just punch, they would encircle. The plan was fourfold. The U.S. 2nd Corps would attack up the coast. The British 13th Corps would launch a direct assault into the Liri Valley. The Polish 2nd Corps, however, would be given the honor of the direct and seemingly suicidal assault on the monastery ruins. The Germans, on the other hand, had anchored their flanks on the impassable Unarici Mountains and believed that no organized force would cross the jagged vertical peaks. They were wrong. Yun's corps included 9,000 Moroccan soldiers. These were not regular infantry. They were Berber mountain specialists wearing traditional Moroccan attire, armed with knives and supplied by mules. On the night of May 11th at 11 p.m., the entire front arrived. 1,600 Allied guns opened fire in the largest artillery barrage of the Italian campaign. Because of this barrage, the Germans were pinned down, and the Moroccan soldiers began to move in. In silence at night, they scaled the impossible mountains. They would go on to swarm the German defenses from above, overwhelming them in a blur of hand-to-hand combat. In 3 days, the Moroccan soldiers had broken the German line, advanced miles, and were threatening to encircle the entire German 10th Army from the rear. The German commander, von Seger, realized his position was no longer tenable and the flank had been turned. The line was broken. On May 12th, the Poles launched their first assault on the ridges leading to the monastery, Phantom Ridge and Hill 593. It was a hellscape. They were met with a storm of fire from the entrenched paratroopers and were thrown back with horrific losses. However great the loss, the Polish still managed to regroup. On the morning of May 18th, a patrol from the Polish 12th Regiment moved into the silent ruins. The battle was over. They found only 30 wounded Germans. At 10:20 a.m., they raised the red and white flag of Poland over the highest point of the rubble. What was once thought as an unthinkable suicidal attack turned into the greatest Polish victory. On that very mountain, in 1944, the Gustavo line was broken and the road to Rome was finally open. It was a great victory for the Allies, but the price was staggering. The 4 battles of Monte Cassino from January to May had cost the Allies 55,000 casualties and the Germans only 20,000. Armies from all over the globe had bled for this one mountain. Americans, British, French, Moroccans, Algerians, New Zealanders, Indians, South Africans, Canadians, and the Poles. The legacy of Monte Cassino is written in the cemeteries that ring the valley. The Commonwealth War Cemetery, with its endless rows of British, Kiwi, Indian, and Gurkha graves. The American Cemetery at Anzio, and on the slopes of the mountain itself, the Polish War Cemetery. 1,057 Poles are buried there. General Anders, who died in exile in 1970, chose to be buried with his men who died fighting for this abbey. During the final assault, a Polish soldier named Felix Karnowski watched his comrades die, wrote a song to commemorate. It was performed for the survivors just after the victory, and it was called The Red Poppies of Monte Cassino. Its lyrics becoming a shroud of how costly the battle was for the Allies. After the war, the monastery was rebuilt stone by stone, and today it still stands pristine as a symbol of peace and endurance. But the slopes below remain a silent, hallowed testament for the terrible price of liberation and a grave for an army of nations that fought to liberate Europe.